It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. This week, rising energy bills and the cost of living is the big issue at PMQs.
It's a con, a buy now, pay later scheme, a dodgy loan, not a proper plan.
Our plan to tackle the cost of living is faster, more efficient and more generous than anything that they have set up.
Where's Jimmy Savile?
After Keir Starmer is targeted, the Speaker has this message for the Prime Minister.
These sorts of comments only inflame opinions and generate disregard for the House, and it is not acceptable.
Will the government's plan for the NHS tackle the waiting list backlog?
It's not just that they didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining, they dismantled the roof and removed the floorboards.
What I didn't expect is this scaremongering from the honourable gentleman on the plans to recover in the wake of a deadly pandemic.
And in Northern Ireland, was the First Minister right to quit over Brexit checks?
The DUP's actions in unilaterally resigning from the executive are reckless.
The Irish Sea border does not have the support of a single elected representative in this place.
Let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, as we saw in the headlines, again, actually, Keir Starmer focused his questions on the cost of living and particularly energy bills at PMQs this week. What did you make of it?
Well, it's very interesting. Obviously, in the last 24 hours, the focus has shifted to international tensions, and we saw the Prime Minister and the Labour leader both go to NATO headquarters in Brussels yesterday, and, of course, Liz Truss went to Moscow. But on Wednesday, the last time, really, that Boris Johnson was going to be facing MPs for almost 10 or 11 days, because Parliament's just about to start a half-term break, the concentration was really on domestic issues. And it was an interesting session for lots of reasons, not least because after a pretty bruising few weeks for the Prime Minister, he used Prime Minister's questions as an opportunity to get on the front foot and get his own MPs cheering with a big announcement right at the start about coronavirus regulations and restrictions in England, and a pretty clear hint that as soon as Parliament returns after this half-term break, he's going to get MPs to debate those, and he's probably going to be looking to lift most of the restrictions. But Labour, of course, very keen to highlight domestic issues, keen to pick up on comments about crime figures and the suggestion that the government hadn't been taking fraud and online scamming into account when it was talking about crime. But as you say, the Labour leader very, very keen to push home the fact that people are facing real problems with the cost of living, and in April they're about to see a big increase in their energy bills.
Provided the current encouraging trends in the data continue, it is my expectation that we will be able to end the last domestic restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive, a full month early, Mr. Speaker.
Households are going to have to fork out an extra £19 billion on their energy bills. The government is insulting people's intelligence by pretending it's giving them a discount. But it's not. It's a con, a buy now, pay later scheme, a dodgy loan, not a proper plan.
Our plan to tackle the cost of living is faster, more efficient and more generous than anything that they have set up, Mr. Speaker. We've lifted the living wage by record amounts. We've cut the effective tax for people on universal credit, Mr. Speaker, and we're now setting out a fantastic plan to help people with the cost of energy, Mr. Speaker.
His plan is to hand billions of pounds of taxpayers' cash to energy companies and then force families to pay it off in instalments for years to come.
We are giving people in Band D council tax, A to D council tax, council tax valuations across the country. That is 27 million homes. We're giving them the equivalent of a £150 rebate off their council.
There is an alternative. He could stand up to his Chancellor, tell him to support families rather than loading them with debt. Tell him to look at those bumper profits of oil and gas giants. Why on earth is this government forcing loans on British families when they should be asking those with an unexpected windfall to pay a little more to keep household bills down?
What he would be doing, Mr. Speaker, is hitting the energy companies at precisely the moment when we need to encourage them to go for more gas, Mr. Speaker, because we need to transition now to cleaner fuels. The only reason we can do it is because we kept our economy moving in those hard times when they took the wrong decisions. And we came out of lockdown in July, Mr. Speaker, when he opposed it last year. And we kept going over Christmas and New Year when they opposed it, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we have the fastest growing economy in the G7.
The reality is this. On top of the Tory tax rises, on top of the soaring prices, the loan shark Chancellor and his unwitting sidekick have now kicked up a buy now, pay later scheme. It leaves taxpayers in debt, while oil and gas companies say they've got more money than they know what to do with. It's the same old story with this government. Get in a mess, protect their mates and ask working people to pick up the bill.
We have record low youth unemployment. Our plan for the NHS and care is working, Mr. Speaker. They have no plan at all, Mr. Speaker. Our plan for the country is working. We have a great vision, Mr. Speaker, to unite and level up across our country. They have no plan whatever, Mr. Speaker.
In 2017, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was condemned to an extended prison sentence in Iran because of the careless words of this Prime Minister. Now, in 2022, this week, my friend, the Leader of the Opposition, was hounded by thugs outside this Parliament because of the careless, disgraceful words of this Prime Minister.
I don't think that she should either let the thugs and yobs who bullied and harassed the right honourable gentleman off the hook any more, because they are culpable, any more than she should let the Iranian government off the hook, Mr. Speaker, because they are culpable.
Boris Johnson there answering the question posed by the Labour MP Ruth Jones, who was asking the Prime Minister about the claim that he made, the false claim he made last week about Jimmy Savile in relation to Sir Keir Starmer, and the Speaker's also intervened on this.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is the row that came after the publication of the first Sue Gray report into Downing Street parties, and in the exchanges that followed the Prime Minister's statement, he said that when he was DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Keir Starmer had failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile. And as you say, there's no evidence that Sir Keir Starmer was involved in the decision not to press ahead with a prosecution against Jimmy Savile. But the row has rumbled on for days, and Labour MPs had been calling on Boris Johnson to withdraw the comments or apologise.
And some Tory MPs.
And some Tory MPs too. And perhaps the strongest pressure was coming from Tory MPs. And then there was the incident where Sir Keir Starmer was jostled. Now, the Speaker never likes to talk very much about security matters on the floor of the House. And he wasn't ever really going to get, I don't think, into the details of who said what. But he did want to make his concern very clear that this was an incident that had happened really just outside the Houses of Parliament.
Some abuse was directed at the Right Honourable Member, the Leader of the Opposition, yesterday, related to claims made by the Prime Minister in this chamber. But regardless of yesterday's incident, I made it clear last week that while the Prime Minister's words were not disorderly, they were inappropriate. As I said then, these sorts of comments only inflame opinions and generate disregard for the House, and it is not acceptable. Our words have consequences, and we should always be mindful of that fact.
Let's return to the issue of the cost of living that you were talking about earlier, Sean, because there was an important debate and vote at the start of this week, which was on the issue of how much benefits and pensions should be increased by. What happened?
Yes, and this was very controversial because the government takes its decision on how much these payments will increase looking at what inflation was like in September. And as we know, inflation in September was not as high as it is forecast to be in the spring when the changes will take place. So basically, the government's looking in September, inflation is 3.1%. Now the Bank of England is saying that inflation could be a lot higher. And there was a lot of cross-party unhappiness because a lot of MPs were saying, well, we shouldn't be put in this position where we're being asked to approve this increase because it's actually completely out of date and events have now overtaken the government's decision. But as we'll see and hear, the minister wasn't budging.
Will he confirm that by uprating in line with inflation last September, that therefore, given that inflation is likely to be 6% over the year, could be more than 6% by April, according to the Bank of England, then what he is proposing today is in fact a real terms cut for those on benefits and the pension?
We're following the policy that governments have followed for many years, which is to increase in line with the Consumer Price Index over a year to September 2021.
We're asking those with least to get themselves not only through this winter, but through all of next year and all of next winter, based on an inflation measure that was actually taken before this winter. So they're going to be paying their energy bills in March 2023 based on a calculation of what they needed in September 2021.
To put it simply, this government is knowingly, yes, knowingly, going to drive more and more families, children, pensioners and some of the most vulnerable people in our society into desperation and poverty.
Talk has been made about poverty. Our approach is absolutely to tackle poverty, and since 2020, 700,000 fewer people are in absolute poverty before housing costs, 100,000 fewer children, 200,000 fewer pensioners.
So what happened in the vote, Sean?
Well, in the end, the below-inflation increase was approved, and the government had a pretty big majority. It was 298 votes in favour to 29 against. That's a majority of 269.
As you say, pretty significant and a comfortable majority for the government. We'll come back to you later on in the programme. It's time to go to the Scottish Parliament and speak to our reporter there, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, the Finance Secretary has been talking this week about the budget and her plans on the cost of living and how to tackle some of the issues. What did she say?
Yeah, so it's been a good news week for the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, starting with the announcement on Tuesday that she's pregnant, that she'll go on maternity leave over the summer, becoming the first Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government to do so. And then yesterday, the Scottish budget passed its final stage. Now, passing was never really in doubt due to the SNP and the Greens having a deal, a power-sharing deal, but the question was exactly what would be in it. The original form of the budget had been published in December, but there have been changes in the later stages due to this cost of living crisis, and particularly the question was around how the 290 million that was coming to Scotland as a result of the Chancellor's announcement of the rebate on council tax bands A to D in England, how that would be used, with the First Minister having committed to every penny going on the cost of living crisis.
This is not enough. Households across Scotland, across the UK, are struggling with the wide range of rising costs, and many of the macro levers, for example, around energy regulation, reside with the UK Government. And so in that spirit, I'll be writing to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, again highlighting that we do need to work together urgently to use our joint powers to do more to tackle the cost of living. And I hope that this chamber can unite in that bid.
The SNP should remember that budgets are about spending money wisely. Because of the arithmetic in this Parliament, I go back to this again, and the unholy alliance between the SNP and the Greens, this budget has been a fait accompli from day one, with very little engagement, I may say, with the other political parties. It's a budget that has failed to put economic recovery first, and it's failed to put forward the delivery of local services. The SNP, in my opinion, has failed to listen to business, it's failed to listen to local government, and it's failed to understand where the public priorities lie. As such, we cannot support it.
As a budget, we think it's timid, regressive and unambitious, and doesn't do nearly enough to alleviate the cost of living crisis, which is no longer looming in the distance, but, as the Cabinet Secretary herself said, is staring us directly in the face.
Well, cost of living is obviously a huge topic right now, and that also came up at First Minister's questions this week, with Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar pushing for more action from the Scottish Government on that. He's particularly been pushing the First Minister to support a windfall tax on energy companies. He said it was unbelievable that SNP and Tory MPs at Westminster hadn't supported that. He accused both the Scottish and UK governments of failing to support people across the country, and the First Minister of not taking enough action in the Scottish Parliament. Now, the First Minister said she had no objection to a windfall tax, and that companies seeing rising profits should make more of a contribution, but that was something for the Conservatives at Westminster to lay out, not within her power. But she also said that she was taking action, the government was taking action, and mentioned things like the doubling of the Scottish child payment and support for winter costs and fuel bills in Scotland.
Jenny, we got an important announcement from the First Minister saying that the requirement for pupils to wear face masks in classrooms is going to be scrapped. What did she say?
Indeed, that announcement came just before First Minister's questions yesterday. It was expected. So face masks in classrooms are going to be dropped from after the half-term break, the February break, so from the 28th of February in Scotland. Pupils and teachers will no longer have to wear face masks in classrooms, although they can if they want to, and they'll continue to do so in the shared spaces, communal areas such as corridors. Now, that had been an announcement that had been waited for some time. The Scottish Conservatives have certainly been pushing for change, and on Tuesday at the latest COVID statement, the First Minister had said that was coming, but she was unable to make that and any announcement at that time due to the Specialist Advisory Group meeting at that time on Tuesday, but she said she would make an announcement as soon as possible. Now, there had been concerns about the rising case numbers in the under-15s age group. That's now settled out, so that's been part of the reason for change, as has falling hospitalisations across the board, and the fact that the R number is now thought to be around 1 in Scotland.
Scottish Conservatives have urged for weeks that young people should no longer be forced to wear face coverings in classrooms for 7 hours a day. Young people's education has been unnecessarily disrupted for far too long. Finally, after weeks of refusing to budge, the government has U-turned, and while it's welcome, it has taken far much longer than was necessary.
Had we made this change weeks ago, we would have done so at a time of soaring infection rates amongst school-age children, and put school-age children and indeed those who work with them in schools at greater risk. And of course, secondly, had we done it before today, we would have been acting against expert and scientific advice. It would have been the wrong thing to do. We are doing it now at the right time and in line with advice, and I think that marks the responsibility of this government in contrast to the irresponsibility of the main opposition.
And again, a subject related to this came up in response at First Minister's questions, and that's about ventilation in schools, with Anas Sarwar, Scottish Labour leader, saying that this makes ventilation and things like HEPA air filters more important. That's something that's been a topic for discussion over the last week. There was a bit of jeering last week at First Minister's questions over the concept of cutting the bottom of doors in some schools to improve ventilation. That also was made a joke of by Boris Johnson at PMQs on Wednesday. But that's something that's still being looked at, and we look like we're coming into a new phase, certainly at the moment, of the pandemic in Scotland, with the announcement also on Tuesday that the Scottish Government is going to publish its framework agreement for the way forward on the 22nd of February, and the Scottish Conservatives publishing their view of what this should look like already on Tuesday.
Yes, as you say, Jenny, it looks as if things are changing to some extent on the COVID restrictions front. And MSPs have also been debating the upcoming nationalisation of a key rail service. What's the background to this?
Well, this was the confirmation of something that had already been announced. It was also within the Scottish Government, the SNP's manifesto, that at the end of the Abellio contract, which runs ScotRail, the main rail services across Scotland, it would be nationalised, taken back into Scottish Government control. So we had confirmation of that this week from Transport Secretary Jenny Gilruth, that the Scottish Government will take over control of ScotRail from the 1st of April. But questions about what this is actually going to look like. Jenny Goruth was pointing out particularly that with the pandemic there have been a lot of changes to the way rail services are used, that there's been a move away from weekday commuting and much more leisure travel, with weekends now actually being the busiest period. That's led to a look at different services. There have been concerns from opposition parties about the potential for cuts to services, to staffing numbers, to station opening hours. Jenny Goruth said she couldn't imagine there would be compulsory redundancies, but she's still got to talk to unions. And it's very much up in the air. She announced a national conversation and she wants to talk to the opposition parties about what this new rail service might look like going forward.
Presiding Officer, today I can confirm that the transition of ScotRail into Scottish Government control will take place on the 1st of April 2022. And whilst that's good news, it's clear that much work still needs to be done, and in a collaborative way, to ensure the long-term sustainability of rail operations in Scotland. Change will happen on April the 1st, so my invitation to all members today is let's have that conversation about the change. Let's work together to influence how it happens. After all, we all want a railway that delivers for our constituents.
Presiding Officer, if this is to be a new beginning for ScotRail, then there must be a new direction from the Government, a new ambition for the future. However, the starting point for the new ScotRail is cuts of 250 daily services, 50,000 fewer seats on trains, the biggest fare hike in a decade as we face a climate emergency. I welcome the Minister saying that she's in listening mode, but can I say to the Minister, the test will be what the Minister does, not just what the Minister says.
And this also came up at First Minister's questions, with Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross asking for a commitment that there would be no cuts to rail services. Now, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said that she wanted to see a rail service that was fit for the future, but obviously they'd have to keep under review any changes to the patterns of rail use.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thank you very much for all that. Let's return to events here in Westminster with you, Sean. Now, the government has been talking about their plan to tackle the huge backlogs in the NHS. Waiting lists are enormous, 6.1 million people waiting for routine operations. But we saw there in the headline, opposition MPs weren't overly impressed, and particularly since the Health Secretary indicated that actually waiting lists will continue to climb rather than come down anytime soon.
Well, yes, and they'd also been waiting for the Health Secretary. We had expected that the government was going to publish its recovery plan and set out how it was going to deal with this great big backlog in waiting lists in the NHS in England right at the start of the week. But the announcement didn't come, and there was much talk at Westminster that there was some sort of feud going on behind the scenes and that the Treasury had perhaps blocked this report because it wasn't happy with what the Health Department was doing. So Labour asked an urgent question and a minister was brought to the Commons and, of course, wasn't able to say very much because the report hadn't been published, although the particular minister, Edward Arger, did stress that the Treasury were fantastic people to work with and they couldn't really ask for better...
Nothing to see here.
Exactly. Nothing to see. No rows at all. And then, after we'd had this delay, and there'd been this big row, and Labour had said it was like something out of the BBC satire, the thick of it, the very next day, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, comes to the Commons and announces the results of this long-awaited report. And as you say, it was not good news.
The number of people waiting for elective care in England now stands at 6 million. That is up from 4.4 million before the pandemic. This bold and radical vision has been developed with expert input from clinical leaders and patient groups. It won't just reset the NHS to where it was before COVID, but build on what we have learnt over the past 2 years to transform elective services and make sure that they are fit for the future.
The single biggest challenge facing the NHS is the workforce challenge. There are 93,000 staffing vacancies in the NHS today. It is understaffed, overworked, and if he's not careful, he will lose more people than he is able to recruit. It's not just that they didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining, they dismantled the roof and removed the floorboards. And with the ceiling of their ambition that the Secretary of State outlined today, being to go back to where we were before the pandemic, it's now clear that the longer we give the Conservatives in office, the longer patients will wait.
You know, we've all come to expect the scaremongering that we've just heard from the Labour benches at election time and it's happened in every election campaign since the war. But what I didn't expect is this scaremongering from the honourable gentleman on the plans to recover in the wake of a deadly pandemic.
I'm shocked that some on those benches are trying to pat each other on the back, because right now my heart is breaking, for all those constituents have emailed me telling me that they are in fear and in pain, and what they have just heard is that that may continue for years to come. So where is the plan to fill the almost 100,000 NHS vacancies?
We've had 40,000 join the NHS since over the last 2 years, including many more doctors and nurses. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I have asked the NHS with HEE, which will now become part of the NHS, to come up with a long-term plan, and we will certainly be looking forward to that and investing in it.
Well, Sean, the Health Secretary coming under a certain amount of fire there from opposition MPs. Now, in the meantime, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, carried out a relatively small reshuffle. You can interpret it how you will, in reaction to the Sue Gray report into partisan events at Downing Street, and the Prime Minister perhaps trying to shore up his support. MPs did want to scrutinise one appointment in particular.
That's right, yes. The Prime Minister announced that Steve Barclay, who's already a member of the government, he's an MP and he's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, senior minister in the Cabinet Office, was going to be his Chief of Staff at number 10. Now, this raised a few eyebrows because in the past the Chief of Staff has been a politically appointed official, but it's been very much a full-time job, and that's been that person's main focus. So people were quite intrigued at the idea that Mr. Barclay, who already has quite a lot on his plate, was going to be taking over this job. And so Labour asked an urgent question in the hope of getting Mr. Barclay to come to the Commons and answer questions about his new role, and also explain how he would perhaps be more accountable to Parliament. And it's fair to say they were a little bit disappointed when it was a different Cabinet Office Minister, Michael Ellis, who appeared at the dispatch box.
The changes that the Prime Minister made to his senior team over the course of the weekend will bring renewed discipline and focus to his programme of priorities and deliver them faster for the people of the United Kingdom.
It's always nice to be at the dispatch box against the Minister, but quite honestly, where is the Chief of Staff? Yeah. Is he still in charge of dealing with the Channel crossing, tackling the pandemic, protecting the union, veterans policy and every other priority of the Cabinet Office?
The Chief of Staff role was created, actually, by Tony Blair in response to Labour figures like Jonathan Powell and Alistair Campbell, who had, of course, huge powers in the Blair years to direct civil servants, and they were unelected.
I don't quite know how someone who already has 2 full-time jobs is going to salvage Downing Street's reputation when the Prime Minister has often claimed that they all broke lockdown rules and get regularly tanked up in Downing Street because of the immense workload and the pressure of the job.
How will the honourable member for North East Cambridgeshire do all of these jobs and serve his constituents?
Well, in the same way, if I may suggest, that the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is also the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work, Shadow First Secretary of State, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Member of Parliament for Ashton-under-Lyne.
What a list of job titles. Sean, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to go to Cardiff now and speak to our reporter there, Amelia Belly. Hi there, Amelia. We heard Boris Johnson earlier talking about plans for a council tax rebate in England, and that's led to a debate in the Welsh Parliament. Tell us about it.
Yes, Joe, that's right. So in the Chamber on Tuesday, after the Treasury did announce that homes up to a Band D in England would get that £150 council tax reduction from April to help them deal with the rising cost of living, that we found out that Wales will get equivalent funding under the Barnett formula here. And so the Shadow Finance Minister, Peter Fox, questioned First Minister Mark Drakeford as to whether we will see a similar cut in our council tax too.
I'm sure that that you will agree, First Minister, with me that it's important that this substantial funding is used to provide urgent support to people during this difficult time. What consideration has the Welsh Government given to providing a council tax rebate to help reduce the pressure on families, as well as creating a discretionary fund for local authorities to provide to those households already eligible for a reduction in council tax? Thank you.
What I will say to the member is this, that if we receive £175 million to help households in Wales with the cost of living crisis, that is what the money will be used for. But it will be used in ways that recognise the existing landscape in Wales, the fact that help is already available in Wales and doesn't exist across our border. We will find the most effective ways of getting that money from us to the families who need it, and we'll make those decisions as quickly as we are able.
Well, on Wednesday, it all turned into a bit of a Twitter spat between First Minister Mark Drakeford and the Treasury over how much money the Welsh Government will actually be able to spend. That's because overall, Welsh Government coffers won't see that extra boost from council tax funding due to less spending elsewhere. However, the Welsh Government have still committed to spending the full £180 million they're going to get in consequential funding on helping the Welsh public. However, we haven't got an announcement of what that'll look like yet. We're expecting that next week.
It wasn't the only row, of course, this week. There was a debate over whether the Welsh Government should have more control over natural resources in Wales. How did that come about?
Yes, well, that came about in a particularly heated manner when the discussion turned to the Crown Estate. Now, the Crown Estate is land owned by the Queen in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, managed independently, but with most of the profits going to the UK Treasury. Now, that matters because that includes land resources in Wales, including the seabed up to 15 miles out. And in Scotland, management of the Crown Estate was devolved in 2015. So the Scottish Government get the profits from that. This is a bit of an ongoing bone of contention in Wales. And when the topic turned to this, things got fairly heated.
Why does it work for Scotland and it wouldn't work for Wales?
Well, let's be honest, the Welsh Government don't really, if you think about it, you quite often we hear so much against the UK Government, we even hear things against the Crown. So for me, why is it that you think, because it's working in Scotland, it would work here? It is, Green, please tell me, where is it not working here?
If you will take another intervention. Crown Estate Scotland has just issued leases for 25 gigawatts, a staggering amount of offshore wind generation, because they're driven to do it, because they have the ultimate gain out of that. You're driven to do it because you have the initiative and you have the powers to do it. Yeah, that's why it works.
What I would agree with you is the Welsh Government are not particularly driven to do anything as regards this, but there we go.
Now, the Welsh Government also wants to see management of the Crown Estates devolved, but power for that ultimately rests with the UK Government. And in the words of Welsh Secretary Simon Hart, their attitude can be summarised as, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. However, don't expect to see this debate go away because it does play into wider questions about what the future balance of power will look like between Wales and the other UK nations.
No, I can imagine that will rumble on. And members have also been looking at the very important issue of drink spiking. What did they say?
Well, you might remember in October of last year, we saw a spate of reports of people being spiked on nights out, whether that was through injections or through drinking. Now, in the social justice questions in the Senedd, Welsh Conservative member Tom Giffard asked what actions the Welsh Government have been taking lately to tackle the issue.
And whilst the media attention today perhaps might not be on it as the same way as it was in November, it's still a reality of nights out for many. And I think it requires Welsh Government to work with partners to deliver real change for women. It can't be left to businesses to act alone. So can I ask the Deputy Minister, 13 weeks on from that debate here in the Senedd, what has changed for women in Wales?
I could guarantee that most women have felt in a situation where they have been uncomfortable in a nightclub or in a bar. And I know it's happened to me not too recently in a bar where I was sat there with my wife and I could see our home of democracy. And, you know, I'll try not to use unparliamentary language too, but I was quite firm when this person wouldn't go away. But no, going back to the substance of the member's question, I know that my colleague Jane Hutt, following that, has met with representatives of the police forces in Wales, looking at actually how we can spread that good practice in terms of the Don't Be a Bystander campaign. But I think really there's opportunities for us. You say, it's not for hospitality alone, and I think it's government alone. It's only thing we can tackle collectively, and I think there's probably broader opportunities we can look at in terms of licensing and things, and actually, things that we can put in to make sure people are kept safe.
So you might notice the slightly more collaborative, supportive tone going on in the Senedd there, perhaps drawing a bit more of a contrast with some of the other exchanges we've heard this week.
Well, a good point on which to end. Amelia Belly there at the Senedd. Thank you. Time to go to Belfast and speak to our reporter at Stormont, Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, last week we had that dramatic resignation of the First Minister. What's happened this week?
Yes, this was the resignation of the DUP's Paul Givan, the First Minister, as part of the party's ongoing protest at the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's the specific part of the Brexit withdrawal agreement that applies only here in Northern Ireland. Well, this week now we know some of the consequences of that. What we've also now seen is the automatic resignation of the Sinn Féin Deputy First Minister, and that's because those two positions are actually equal and they're interlinked. However, we haven't seen any impact directly on the other ministers. They still remain in post for the time being. However, it just means that we have no head of government and therefore no cabinet government, if you like, at the moment. So it was a former Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, who rose in the chamber this week to criticise the DUP.
The DUP's actions in unilaterally resigning from the executive are reckless and have caused concern and uncertainty for businesses, for workers, for families and campaigners on a range of many important issues. And in terms of the victims and survivors of historical institutional abuse, it has caused real hurt and real trauma. And while the DUP must bear responsibility for that, I am also very conscious that those of us who are serious about showing responsible leadership and delivering for people can and should seek to salvage what we can from the chaos the DUP have caused.
Whilst the DUP fight internally like cats in a bag, continuing their own stunt politics as a pathetic attempt to claw back votes lost, it is our duty as MLAs to get as much legislation passed as possible. Now is not the time to knock off early. We need to get the job done and work to the end of this mandate.
There has been a lot of posturing and revisionism in the House this morning, some mystified by unionist outrage at the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's important for the record of the House to say the Irish Sea border does not have the support of a single elected representative in this place. There are those in this House who simply expect unionism to stand idly by, whilst they call for the rigorous implementation of an Irish sea border.
This DUP drama has been concocted by Jeffrey Donaldson as a last desperate attempt to resuscitate their flagging poll numbers ahead of an Assembly election. And the SDLP is ready for an election. But we can also see the trap that the DUP has in their desperation set. They want an early election so that they can manipulate and scare people to the polls.
Now, there was some speculation last week that there might be an early election, but the government at Westminster has confirmed that that will not be the case. The election will be on the date planned, which is May the 5th. That means there is this ongoing push now to get legislation through before the Assembly rises at the end of March. Not everything is unaffected, though. There are some issues, for instance, that are affected. For instance, regulations relating to COVID-19. There's a grey area now over whether the Health Minister can lift all of those if he so wishes. And we heard Michelle O'Neill there refer to the fact that there was a planned apology for victims of institutional abuse here in Northern Ireland. That was to come from the head of the executive, but because there is now no head of government here, that apology may not be able to take place.
One important piece of legislation, though, did go through Stormont this week, didn't it, Jim? This was on the issue of organ donations. Tell us what happened.
Yes, I suppose this is an example of what devolution can sometimes do. This was the Organ and Tissue Deemed Consent Bill, which passed this week with all party support. Now, it originally came before Stormont as a private member's initiative, but the First Minister and former First Minister now, Paul Givan, explained why he felt it should be part of official government legislation after he had a phone call from the family of a young boy, Dahi McGowan, who has needed a heart transplant since birth.
The first executive meeting that I chaired as First Minister, this was one of the items that came up, and I can remember the heated debate that took place at the time. It was one of a number of pieces of legislation that had got stuck within the executive, and I committed at that meeting to urgently engage with the Health Minister subsequent to that particular meeting that afternoon. And that evening, I spoke with Robin to get more information from him in terms of the medical profession and their views around it. I spoke with the British Heart Foundation, who have campaigned upon this. And the call that I'll always remember was the one that I had with Dathi's father. And I wanted to speak to him to get a sense of how important it was to him. And I got that from that conversation. And I engaged further later into the night with colleagues about this and got to a place where we were able to have this legislation come from the executive.
Again, I want to put on record my thanks to Mr Givan in taking that step at that time, which allowed us to get us where we are today. And he finished his contribution by talking about hope, because, Mr Speaker, I believe that's truly what this bill brings to the people of Northern Ireland, those who are waiting on an organ donation waiting list. But, Mr Speaker, it's also about that deeper contribution of hope. And this is a bill that demonstrates what this place can actually do when it works together, when it works at its best.
Now, that law will now be named in young Dahi's honour. It means from spring 2023, all adults here in Northern Ireland will be deemed to be potential donors, such as they are in the rest of the UK, unless they specifically decide to opt out.
Jim Fitzpatrick in Belfast, thank you very much. We've got one more story to look at, Sean, this time from the House of Lords. They were debating that very long-running issue to do with the Elgin marbles and whether they should be returned to Greece. Why has this issue come up now?
As you say, it's very long-running. For decades, successive Greek governments have called for the return of what many people call the Elgin marbles, currently resting in the British Museum, but which they called the Parthenon marbles. There's been a renewed push by the current Greek government, and they've seen some responses here with more people speaking up in favour of their return, and there's been some suggestions from opinion polling that people are more willing to see them leave the British Museum. And so it did come up in the Lords, and we got to hear what the government was going to say. And I'm afraid, bit of a spoiler alert, I don't think the government is planning on sending the marbles back right now.
Will he accept that my plea that we should consider returning the marbles is based on the fact that they are a unique piece of art, that they belong together, and they have a proud history in terms of the Greek historical traditions? Surely we should think again.
The Parthenon sculptures were acquired by the late noble Earl Lord Elgin legally, with consent of the then Ottoman Empire. The British Museum is always happy, and its trustees have made clear, to consider loans to museums which recognise their legal ownership of them. That's the stumbling block in this instance.
The British Museum Act has a provision that Nazi-looted art can be sent back, as can human remains within 1,000 years. Should the government consider, or would the government consider, revising the Act to consider the return of other looted artefacts from wheresoever they came?
It was looked at again by a parliamentary committee in 2000 under the chairmanship of the late Sir Gerald Kaufman, and the government has no plans to change the law.
How does the Minister respond to Boris Johnston's earlier elegant words of wisdom when he wrote in more romantic times, "The Elgin marble should leave this northern whiskey-driven gilt culture and be displayed where they belong, in a country of bright sunshine, the landscape of Achilles, the shadowy mountains, and the echoing sea."
Fortunately, government policy is not made fortunately for all ministers, is not made by the things that ministers wrote when we were undergraduates. The Prime Minister has made the long-standing position of Her Majesty's government clear to the Greek Prime Minister most recently when they met in November.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Otherwise, have a very lovely weekend.